Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, we explore Aristophanes' great play, The Frogs, and realize that he was engaged in an early form of literary criticism. Beyond political criticism, which we explored in The Wasps, Aristophanes also engaged in the first primitive iteration and manifestation of literary criticism. While literary criticism, as a modern discipline and enterprise, arguably begins with Alexander Pope's critical translation and assessment of Homer's Iliad, we can claim and arguably point out that Aristophanes was also engaged in a form of literary analysis in his works, and most especially in his famous play, The Frogs. Though a reactionary in values, Aristophanes was also a modernist when it came to style. Aristophanes did not envision a return to the older agrarian Athens of yesteryear, nor was his poetry owed to the writings and styles of Hesiod, Homer, or Aeschylus. The poet whom Aristophanes was indebted to was Euripides. In fact, all of his plays make substantial homages to Euripides, and Euripides is even a central character in several of Aristophanes' plays. Aristophanes' literary style was also Euripidean, but Aristophanes lampooned his literary master, exposing him in the process of being far beneath Aeschylus and Sophocles in substance and intellectual style. We might say then that Aristophanes recognized his debt to Euripides, just as a young man might recognize the debt owed to a polemicist or a comedian who had an important impact on their early life. But as Aristophanes matured, even though he never abandoned the Euripidean style, he came to critique Euripides' shallow intellectualism. This is what makes The Frogs so shocking in its conclusion. Dionysus descends into the underworld to resurrect Euripides because there are no good poets living anymore in Athens, or for all Greece. Dionysus stumbles through the underworld and makes mistake after mistake and is bailed out by his slave Xanthias, while constantly making reference to Euripides in the process, singing praise to the favorite poet. But when Dionysus finally reaches Euripides, he beholds a conflict between Aeschylus and his favorite poet. Dionysus sits to serve as a judge over who is the greater poet. Up to this point, The Frogs has been filled with many references and allusions to Euripides, which gives the audience a false sense of pro-Euripidean security. As mentioned, he is referred to as the poet in the play. Dionysus, as we know, loves him, as he should. Euripides' play, The Bacchae, features Dionysus as a central figure, though Euripides presents Dionysus as a hollow and bloodthirsty god, though perhaps Dionysus probably didn't care much for that truthful depiction of him. When Dionysus judges in favor of Aeschylus and resurrects him to save Athens, Aristophanes is expecting us to know, beyond the literary merits of Aeschylus, what the great poet-playwright advocated and why Dionysus ultimately chose him rather than Euripides. Aeschylus, as we know, was the great poet of Athena, of love, of reason, and of justice. In the penultimate showdown between the two dramatic tragedians, Euripides simply blurts out a rhetorically florid answer. Believe the unsure safe, the safe unsure. Mistrust what you know now to be trust, and fear no more. Given Aristophanes' loathing of the sophists, he is also esoterically asserting that Euripides was a sophist. Listen again to Euripides' outburst. Believe the unsure safe, the safe unsure. Mistrust what you now trust, and fear no more. It's nothing but florid rhetoric. After Euripides' answer, Dionysus is confused and asks for clarification, a moment that indicates the sophistic language employed by Euripides. And of course, if someone gave you an answer like that, you would probably be confused too. Euripides reformulates his answer in a twofold response. Thus, Euripides answered 3 times to say the same thing once. When Dionysus approached Aeschylus, the poet disciple of Athena first asks by inquiring into the situation that Athens now finds herself in. Tell me, what kind of people is the city electing these days? Honest, noble sorts? Aeschylus asks. Dionysus answers, Where have you been? She hates most of them all. Aeschylus converses with Dionysus by rhetorically asking, She prefers hypocrites and swindlers? Dionysus answers, She doesn't prefer them, but she has no choice. Aeschylus closes this dialogue by saying, Well, if the city doesn't know its own mind, I don't see how it can be saved. Euripides, like the sophist he is, does not engage in critical inquiry or conversation. He just talks, blurts, demands. He is a propagandist. He simply shouts slogans, expecting the people to think him intelligent. Aeschylus, being the disciple of reason and justice, inquires and converses with Dionysus. He is engaged in a dialogue as an embodied participant of Logos before giving his final response. Aeschylus' response employs reason, conversation, and inquiry, the very things necessary for civilization to flourish. The chorus ends by singing, Fortunate is the man who has his mind with sharp wit and intelligence. Tradition and experience in this showdown trump youth and passionate vigor. Aeschylus was the man of tradition and experience, while Euripides, though dead, was the embodiment of youthful impetuousness and rash belief and actions. We might say youthful pride. Aeschylus is subsequently resurrected to save the city for us by educating the fools. Here, Aristophanes harshly mocks Athenian exceptionalism yet again by presenting Athens as a den of fools, preferring hypocrites and swindlers rather than honest and noble leaders. Aristophanes not only adjudicates in favor of the literary merits of Aeschylus, even though he regularly and continues to acknowledge his debt to Euripides, he also adjudicates for the traditional wisdom, filial piety, and rationalism of Aeschylus over the passionate vigor of Euripides and the sophistry that he represents. Even though modernity is wrought by Euripides, and that is the literary river that Aristophanes swam in, and in fact swam in during the entirety of his life, Aristophanes' maturity as a writer comes to let him see that it is Aeschylus and Sophocles and the older poet-dramatists who have much more substance to them than the younger dramatists who are currently all the rage in Athens. As such, Aristophanes sees the greatness of Aeschylus as not simply having been literary, but also societal, political, and practical. After all, it is Aeschylus who says, "The truly great artist has always had a useful lesson to teach." And in Euripides giving that line to Aeschylus and ruling in favor of Aeschylus in the showdown between Aeschylus and Euripides, Aristophanes gives us a nod. He tells us in that line who the truly great artist was and what the useful lessons he had to teach us were. When you read the frogs, you must see in between the lines, and as you do, you realize that Euripides was subtly engaged in a very engaging and important form of literary criticism by showing us who the greater poets were and what their great lessons that they could teach us were. For Aeschylus, it was to become a participant in logos, to be rational, to engage in inquiry, for only the rational can ultimately resolve our problems. The intemperance and vigor of youth, as expressed by Euripides, often makes things only worse.